Hey everybody, it's Pete A. Turner, and this is a bonus episode of the Break It Down show. Dr. Rich and I are about to present next week a paper in Alabama at Troy University for their NATO conference. A paper titled Examining the Ground Truth for Military Operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, Engaging Islam, Political Development, and NATO's Involvement in Modern Conflicts. That's a whole lot of words, and those words might change. But the idea of this paper is just to illustrate for all of us combat warriors who are trying to figure out how to do this stuff better, how to leverage religion to our advantage so we can create stability in a region. We're not very good at this, in part because we don't really train on it. And in a lot of places, the separation of church and state is not a thing. For example, the government of Afghanistan is called the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. It's in the title. Religion is. How about this? On Iraq, the flag says Allah Akbar on it. If we don't consider these important factors when we're going overseas to create stability, and we're in over 100 countries trying to create stability, religion is a major factor. NATO goes to a lot of places. So this paper deals with that. I think you'll find it interesting. For sure, leave comments. Let's talk. You can get a hold of me at pete@breakitdownshow.com or at Pete A. Turner on all social media, and I'd love to talk to you. Let's get this one started. Once again, dealing with religion and conflict zones.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hello, this is Dr. Rich Ledet down in Troy University.
And this is Pete A. Turner in lovely Orange County, California.
You are listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
I have Dr. Rich and I on the show today because we're doing one of these academic shows. We'll do for sure a show later on that tightens up the picture of what we're doing. So we are, in effect, kind of sorting out loud our concept for our latest paper. So there's going to be some evolution from this. But I find these good exercises not only for Rich and I to really develop what we've got, but also to deliver this to the academic minds and the military minds that are curious about our concepts. So, and I know the audience likes it because they're always like, man, those shows are incredible. They're fascinating because I never even think about this, never knew to think about it. And so that's what we're doing today. And we're going to deal with our latest paper. And I'm going to give Rich the honor of introducing the paper right now.
Thanks, Pete. This paper we're presenting at a conference hosted by my university, Troy University, but put on by NATO. It's NATO's 70th anniversary. We submitted an abstract. We wanted to talk about the intersection between religion and political development, specifically looking at the Afghanistan and Iraq cases. The title of our paper is Examining the Ground Truth for Military Operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, Engaging Islam, Political Development, and NATO's Involvement in Modern Conflicts. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, Professor, help us out. Understand what you're saying there. What are you talking about?
So when we talk about engaging Islam and political development, we're looking at the intersection between two really big concepts here, religion and political development. When we say political development, we're primarily looking at state building. And we're not just trying to be critical of NATO countries' involvement in the affairs of other countries. We like to point our finger at the United States and U.S. foreign policy as much as we can, but we're not just talking about failures. In this paper, we also have some success stories. And this is not just a pros and cons kind of article. We've actually been able to, I had to go back and do some homework.
Okay.
Some graduate student homework and pretend I was in graduate school again and teach myself some stuff. And I actually found a place for this paper within some of the comparative state building literature. And I think that we have a good theoretical approach. We've got the concepts down that are already in the literature, but what we do have is, between Pete and myself, we've got some ground truth stories about how we succeeded and also did not succeed in some cases when we engaged religion or disregarded religion, because that's another key component of this paper as well.
Okay, there's a couple of terms I want to get into. How do you define, and do we have an academic definition for ground truth? And am I correct in thinking that we are the people that are defining what ground truth is?
Well, I think if you talk to the military science or the military history audience or even the military policy people, they'll tell you ground truth it's something at the tactical level that should be informing decisions made at the operational level, which should ultimately factor into our strategic goals and our strategic planning. But when we talk about ground truth, what we're really trying to get at is using some of the things that we saw on the ground and taking that and trying to make some sense of it. It's a combination of some things we've seen with some lessons learned. It also involves, I would say, kind of essentially the spirit of the ground truth is telling the powers that be exactly what's going on, but also speaking truth to power is part of it, but it's also sometimes power doesn't even know what it doesn't know. That's long-winded, but what do you got?
Let me take a crack at it, too, because we work below the tactical level, below the boots on the ground level, because those guys come with a different skill set. Tankers are going to tank. Tankers going to tank, and artillery guys are going to artillerize. So when we come in, these boots in the ground aren't trained up. They don't have a system like we have. That's why we write these papers, just to help show what our system is, because you and I both know we can be in the exact same patrol and see a completely different world than the boots on the ground see. The ground truth is a truth that is only discernible if you've got that kind of experience and systematic way of looking at things, where you accept that culture is different, that religion, hey, Rich, religion matters. And if those things aren't real in your world, then you aren't allowed to see the ground truth, and you can't see it. You only have a myopic version of it, and it causes units to make poor decisions. And that's why ultimately most of our work, and this is direct firsthand Pete knowledge, I spent most of my time getting us to stop doing dumb shit that was contrary to our goals than I ever spent on worrying about the enemy, because we were the biggest enemy in the area, because we hold all the power. We create more instability by our simple presence and then by our actions not being reliable and leading directly to the outcomes that we want. Hey, this is A Turner from the Break It Down Show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to SaveTheBrave.org, click on the Donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show. And leading directly to the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, and part of what you're getting at is with this idea, with this concept of ground truth that we use quite frequently, it's the ability to understand the nuances. It's the ability to understand also the framework of the environment in which you're operating in. Another concept we like to use is infrastructure of the mind. It's simultaneously being able to put on a different set of lenses, but before you can put on those lenses, you got to take off another set of lenses. We make the joke about tankers going to tank, but at the same time, tankers are trained to use tanks and maneuver warfare and engage in war against a known enemy. But part of this idea of ground truth is sometimes you don't know what the enemy is. And like you just said, sometimes we're our own enemy. We're getting in the way of progress. So ground truth also involves eliminating some of the biases that you might have and understanding that your preconceived notions of the operating environment may just be based on assumptions that aren't really true.
One of the things that goes to that exact thing is our approach. And this is something I developed in Iraq along with commanders, but the civil population is the center of gravity. When you say that to military strategists and operational guys, they spit their coffee out. They can't take it. You don't know what center of gravity means. And that is the exact perfect nexus between ground truth and operational truth. And when we are able to explain this well, the people who actually have a mission to run are going to listen to us and change how they operate in an area, because we do bring that ground truth. And this whole concept comes from a general I met who ran a division in Iraq named General Wolf. And he's like, I never get enough ground truth. I get told things that people tell generals. What I don't have is someone who tells me exactly what they see, and I will figure out how I want to address that reality. So when we say things like the civil population is the center of gravity, that's probably not even Rich and I talking. That's the commander saying, help me get these people moving in a direction that makes sense to our goals.
Yeah, and that general arguably is operating across. I mean, he's plugged in to the spaceship. He understands the strategic goals. He probably also understands whether or not the strategic goals are clear or lacking in clarity. He's involved in operations and sending people out to do missions on a daily basis. So that general needs a little bit of clarity. And that general needs some boots on the ground that aren't just, acting like chess pieces. Needs some boots on the ground that can look at the chessboard and see something differently than that general's going to see. Like, for example, here's the religious component. Maybe we don't need to disregard the fact that, especially in some of the more rural areas that we're talking about, Iraq and Afghanistan, you need to have a fundamental understanding of the history of some of these areas and how intertwined into the culture and intertwined essentially, and to take this back to some political science land, governance in these areas is made legitimate or has legitimacy because of the religious element in part. I want to make sure we don't get past the disregarding religion and define what that means too before we get all the way into the political science part. So when we say customary disregard for religion, what are we saying? Well, and that phrase comes from some political science literature that we've relied heavy on, specifically researchers who have embedded themselves in countries such as the ones we're discussing here, not in a military capacity, though, acting more as anthropologists or ethnographers. What's unique about some of the work that we're doing is we're doing this, with the military and on DoD orders. So when we say customary disregard, we have a tendency for not paying attention to the power of local governance. And we have a tendency to disregard local custom and how important local custom is in many operating environments. We just disregard that because we primarily have a Western or what I guess some people would say a European-centric style way of thinking about governance and thinking about governing and thinking about some of these concepts that we mentioned in the paper, such as the state.
Okay, so let's get into some of this stuff. So the idea of the paper is to reveal, one, the academic literature that talks about these kind of disregards of religion or other things, and state building versus nation building. And all of this we're sort of cobbling together. What are we adding to the literature? Are we challenging literature, or are we establishing new ground, would you say, in this paper, Rich?
Well, I think what we're doing is a little bit of the first and the last things you said. And I'd hesitate to say we're challenging because what we're doing is engaging in an academic discussion where people are challenging each other's thoughts all the time. And I think that our observations are both challenging some of the literature that's there and also adding to some of the literature that's there. But I think we're breaking new ground because I haven't come across much that looks at this from the perspective of military operations, which is to say taking the ground truth and writing a paper that's using the academic framework to describe what we saw on the ground, what you saw in Iraq, and what you and I both saw in Afghanistan. So I think I hesitate to say we're directly challenging some things, but I think we're adding to it, and we're adding to it by breaking new ground. Because like I said, a lot of what I've seen comes from people who've been on the ground. Political scientists doing area studies are generally doing themselves a service by acting like anthropologists for a little while and living in the countries in which they're studying. But also what I've seen in the literature, and if we are going to be critical, or if I am going to say that we're making a critique, one thing that we are critical of is the research that only takes place in the spaceship. There's a lot of work here that happens at the theoretical level or the policy-making level, but I just don't see a lot of research. And if there are any listeners out there that are aware of some, please send it my way. I just don't see a lot that's speaking from an on-the-ground perspective, and specifically in the context of military operations.
One of our concepts that we deliver, and it's basically the first rule of stability operations, is our mere presence creates instability. And that's a big lens for commanders to pick up and go, holy shit, I am the most influential force in this region. Talk a little bit about that and how that blends into the religious factor when we're not accepting, religion is in the fucking title of the Afghanistan government and Allah Akbar is on the flag of Iraq.
Yeah, and I believe both the constitutions of both of those countries that came after our military operations there, well, we're still operating there, but their constitutions had to strike a balance between secular government and also the religious legitimacy afforded by Islam. Their constitutions are taking care of that also. It may be a little ambiguous, but hey, so is our constitution in parts, So I think what I need to do is also take a step back and address this issue of the state, however, because this idea of the state matters because, and what you just said is a lot of commanders don't understand that they are the biggest power broker, the most important power broker, the most influential person is going to be that battle space owner in these types of environments, which are primarily post-conflict environments or environments like the situation in Afghanistan where, we were the cause of the conflict to begin with. And for good reason, getting rid of the Taliban was necessary, I think. However, at minimum, a modern state's job is to provide security. And who is providing security in Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, when we first invaded Iraq and once we went into Afghanistan, who is providing security? It's the United States military or other other members of the NATO alliance.
Right.
And that's difficult, I think. That's a hard pill for us to swallow. Well, wait a minute. We're providing security because there's something that has to happen in terms of state building. There has to be a transition of authority from NATO member countries or the United States providing the bulk of the security and the forces to, we have to transition that over to a functioning government, which essentially that means we have to transition this power or this monopoly over the means of the use of force and violence. We have to give this back to the host country. And I don't want to get us too far off base, but we've written about this before in terms of transition operations. And that's a delicate thing to deal with in terms of providing the groundwork, a stable groundwork that you can develop other political institutions off of.
And when you're talking about this delicate thing, the foundation and transitioning this stuff, there must be a ton of doctrine and training done on these things because it sounds like it's like one of the critical things if you want to have a controlled outcome towards, especially like Afghanistan. The entire plan was based on, let's create this capacity in the police and all these different things and a massive organized thing. We focused on transitioning this power and doctrine in some way, I'm assuming somewhere. Is that correct?
Well, unless it's been developed over the last few years, I'm not sure it's there.
Say what?
Yeah, I mean, we've, and see, this is where the political science stuff comes in to help. I mean, there's literature on this that looks at some of this nuance, and actually, you can find some ground truth in peer-reviewed academic journal articles if you look. And but this is again where I had to put my grad student and put my professor hat on and get back to work, because there's a period of time here, and there's many different transitions that have to take place. But you can't just, for example, assume that you can invade Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, give them a constitution, have an election, wipe your hands, and everything's fine. I think some of the policymakers at the upper echelon in the spaceship believe that was the case. In fact, I've read some of that in the academic literature that looks at the Iraq case, where strategic level thinkers were not prepared for what happened on the ground. And so, thinking about the contribution this paper makes is we're trying to provide some of that nuance, and we're trying to provide some of the, use the academic literature and fit the stories that we have into that academic framework, because that framework provides us with a way to have a discussion and to point out where some of these transitions need to take place. Now, one of the transitions, actually the transition we're most concerned about in this paper is how we use religion to move from that, or how religion can be used, how we can engage the religious element to move from that point where we're providing the security, we're the police force, we're providing the only means of stability, whatever stability is there, and transitioning that to the formal government, or to what we might call this nebulous concept of the state.
Okay. Now we're in it. So let's work on denebulizing the state and try to understand in a place where there isn't a state effectively. And I think this goes right into our ground truth thing. There is a state operating there. You and I go out and try to find the big state, and we often struggle to see it. But we can find people, Haji Hashim, that guy's phone doesn't stop ringing because he is in the government of the informal state. If you can't allow that to happen, then you just see him as a warlord or a tribal elder without much influence. And you also disregard the main tribal council in the province that really holds the real power. So help me understand that, and then again, religion's role in that.
Well, I like the use of Haji Hassan as an example, because he is a warlord. There's many definitions for warlords, but as it turns out, in some of these places that we're talking about, in some of these countries, it's those warlords that are providing stability. They essentially have the monopoly of the use of violence in that village cluster, in that valley, in that city. But he also has something else. He's a tribal elder, right? He's a tribal leader. So he's got this family lineage that gives him a certain amount of authority. But there's a reason we call him Haji.
Right.
Because he's done some things that, according to his belief system, have afforded him a certain level of prestige. And in terms of thinking about governance, not the same as government, right? Government is this formal thing, executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial system, but governance is the ability to manage your own affairs in a given territory. So Haji Hassan is what he has is he might have a bunch of AK-47s and a gang of people that are willing to use them. Throw some RPGs in there, he becomes a fighting force, but he's also a tribal leader, right? He's got some family history. He understands the local culture. He understands local customs, but he's also this religious elder. So when we talk about engaging with religion, that's what we're talking about in part, is recognizing that in many places, it's not just it's not just the warlord who's the boss. It's not just the tribal leader who's the boss. There's this religious component that if you overlook it, or you pretend it's not there, or if you just disregard it altogether, you're essentially doing the same thing that has historically been done Well, in Afghanistan and to some extent in Iraq, where you've totally disregarded local culture and local custom, you've totally disregarded the informal, and I don't want to say the informal state because I don't want any of my scholar friends to get mad at me for abusing concepts, but there's an informal way of governing, right? There's already governance in place. And again, that's another reason why concepts matter, right? Because we can go out and look for government all day long. You and I are, looking at the district center and we're talking to people and we're asking them about the government and they laugh. We point to the building where the government is and they're like, no, it's not a government. There's some gangster in there who still owes me money, they call him the district governor, but he's not governing. And as it turns out, there's still a lot of governing that's going on. It just happens this is the below district level that we're talking about. And this gets back to, as we're trying to conceptualize this idea of the ground truth, it takes a mission to go out there and ask those questions. But if your tactics aren't adjusted to allow people like Pete and myself who can take off their tanker lenses or their infantry lenses or even take off your intel lenses, go in there and start from scratch and figure out exactly what's going on, right? And by start from scratch, I mean just get rid of your pre-existing assumptions that, this guy's a warlord, we can't use him. This guy's just a tribal leader and he's not abiding by the Constitution, or this guy's a religious elder. Well, wait a minute, there's a problem with Islam. That's crazy, That's crazy talk. Why are we going to go to the mullah? Well, that mullah or that guy who's been on the Hajj, hey, man, maybe they've got a little bit of clout here, and maybe they can actually help you stabilize this area that is known for instability. Oh, because by the way, you're here in the first place, Mr. Commander.
And also keep in mind, because as a guy that stays in the area, you begin to develop a sense for how the Afghans deal with us. One of the things that the people who are often truly influential, they don't want anything to do with the Americans. They've been burned too many times. They're not, in favor of, the Americans aren't in favor of them. And so they just disappear over a year or two. They're still there every day doing their stuff, but you don't have access to having an audience with them, even though they're fantastically influential, because it's easy for us to be played as unimportant players because we don't know the right people and they won't interact with us. So you need, again, a Rich and a Pete to go in and meet the informal leaders, build bridges, and regain access to people that you have no idea that they exist. So we've illustrated a lot of the problem. Let's talk about opportunities, whether they were realized or not. What do you want to cover next?
Okay, well, I want to take us back to political science world for a little bit, and understanding. I've already mentioned about the state's job is to provide security, but the state can also is supposed to perform other functions. One of those other functions is delivering social services, keeping the water running, keeping the lights on, those kind of things that actually enhance human welfare. That once the state has provided security and stability for the people that live in the area, there's other thing the state or the formal government, perhaps we can call it. Again, using these concepts gets kind of tricky, but there's something else that the state is responsible for, and that is ensuring that the people that live there are represented in government, right?
Okay.
So I know you've got a few stories that might be able to help our listeners understand how opportunities were both missed but also capitalized on. So thinking about security or enhancing human welfare or this idea of representation, representing interests, you pick a story and you tell me where you would like to start.
Well, I think the Ctesiphon Arch in the Baghdad province out in the Mada'in district is a good example because it sort of encaptures all of that. You have a UNESCO historic site, cultural heritage site, It's not one, but it's that great of a archaeological site, right? And then there's all kinds of archaeological ruins, so you can tie in Ministry of Antiquities, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Tourism, but you also have the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the police, the interior, I guess. All of these things working together in the same region to create a robust, job-packed place where people can start to, and it's surrounded by farms. Guess what those farmers are going to do? They're going to have a direct-to-market opportunity to bring figs and tomatoes and all the things they're growing. There's tons of fish farms out there. So you have this opportunity to create a lot of power within the government and directly deliver services to the people.
So what was the religious component of this?
Well, yes, yeah, this is the thing. And the thing I want to say before that is we had no idea this existed well into our stay in Iraq.
That's
and
a problem.
We came in like dummies and happened to learn the lesson by accident. I can come to that later on. But the religious aspect is fantastic. So the Ctesiphon arch is an arch. It's an ancient Persian arch. It was like the summer home or the winter home for part of the Persian Empire. And it's still there. I mean, some of it crumbles every day, but it's still there. And it's an incredibly beautiful sight to see. Across the street from that is Salman Salman al-Farsi, Salman the Farsi. He was the barber for Muhammad. He's like his best buddy. They were like, they hung out together. And so you have this Islam Shia-based monument to this guy, but Sunni people also like it too because it's Muhammad. It's before the split. So you have that element. And you also have this museum dedicated to Iraq's victory over Iran during the war in the 80s. So you have all of these things in the area, then it draws people from all over the Middle East and also potentially all over the world. So when you're looking at the requirements for religion, and this is the governor explaining this to us American dummies, he's like, look, you have to have a Shia and a Sunni presence. And in this area, they all cohabitated. And every meeting you went to had a Sunni-Shia overtone, which is really, in this case, a political overtone. Because they dress different, they talk different, and they're just different, but they're the same to us. We can't see it. They all can see it.
The religious component's there, but this is also becomes a political issue.
Yes.
So it's not just about religious grievances, for example. There could be an airing of political grievances or an opportunity to address political grievances between two different religious elements. Does that sound accurate?
There's actually, but wait, there's more. Because this area, and this used to be this way, it had a hotel and casino. An Islamic dude can't run a casino. Yep. And so what you do is you go up north. Not all Kurds are Christians, but you get a Christian Kurd from the north to come down and run the casino. Nobody's going to fuck with that guy because he's doing his job in the community of driving revenue and giving the tourists what they want. So you have a Christian and a schism binding Islamic agreement. And it's an incredible thing that you have all these things in one area. You don't want to ask the outcome of this whole thing because it does not go well. But the opportunity was there, and if we had known, maybe we could have provided that oversight, that over-security. But we couldn't get State Department to care about it. We couldn't get the Iraqi government to care about it, and so the whole thing crumbled. But look at the opportunity with that arch and that community around it. And they were all desperate. They all said, whatever else happens, if you guys can make that go, we'll all get along a lot better.
And this was a missed opportunity because this could have been a point of stability because from my reading of the story, this arch was a point of pride. It didn't matter, Shia, Sunni, Kurd, didn't matter. This was a point of pride. So this was something that you could have built into the planning and procedures there. We could have taken care of this or given a little bit more of attention or even just understood its significance in a slightly different manner. I don't know, maybe with a little bit of ground truth.
Yeah.
We could send that up to higher because this actually could have been a point of security. It could have been an area that enhanced human welfare. You've got farmers farming. You've got the museum there. You've got people working, generating some economic activity. That sounds like a positive step. but also just the idea that you're using this symbol or this architectural wonder, and everybody's interests seem to be represented here. And it may not be the same as, political representation where all of these different groups are represented in government, but at least here in the marketplace, that sounds like an area where we could have improved our approach or adjusted our approach, and maybe.
Hey, this is A Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Our approach or adjusted our approach, and maybe brought about a little more cohesiveness amongst the Iraqi people. Sounds like a pretty big missed opportunity to me.
When I was there and I learned of this plan, I was with my third commander. Think about that. We had missed this over and over and over and over again. We had thought, well, let's use this arch as something. We happened to have an archaeologist who was flying remote control planes for the infantry. And he's like, yeah, there's a thing down there called the arch. I'm like, yeah, I'm looking right at it. He's like, that thing's super important. I don't know anything about it. I just know you should look into it. And so that was like my first tip, that this thing was important. And we started asking questions about it. And it was the most important thing in the area. And it took us, 2.5 years to figure it out. And
the most important, yeah. And to the people who live there, that must have really just been a thorn in their sides. Like, look at the Americans.
Uh-huh.
Well, let me. I'll keep you in Iraq, but
okay.
One of these other requirements of the state, or things the formal government's supposed to be doing. Delivering services,
okay.
Right? And I'm not talking about, everybody needs their Social Security and their free Medicare, right? I'm talking about basic services that humans need to survive and live. Keep the water on kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Make sure we got electricity. Because you have some interesting perspectives on the Red Crescent.
Yeah, well, the Red Crescent is one of these things where we struggle as the U.S. and really as NATO with the Red Crescent. They're not even akin. They are part of the Red Cross organization and, the greater organization. But when we see them, we say they are tied to Iran, they're tied to Iranian influence, and all these other things. And all of that may be true. We would never say that about the Red Cross, by the way. We only say it about the Red Crescent. And maybe the Red Crescent is infiltrated. But the reality is, when it shows up on the ground and it fixes our failed water projects, who's delivering resources to the Iraqis?
One of their own aid agencies, not ours.
Right.
Now, perhaps it's more appropriate, though, for the Red Crescent to be there. Because the Red Crescent, if I'm not mistaken, this was an organization that it's a spinoff of the Red Cross. The Red Cross is older, but the Red Crescent has the kind of understanding of local culture and custom.
Right.
Because it has an understanding, I think the leadership of that organization, they have an understanding of the power of Islam and how Islam brings with it some legitimacy. And another thing is, even though I know the Red Cross, its flag that's not a Christian cross, that's not what it's supposed to be. But if you think in terms of symbolism and what symbols mean, especially to people that are not quite as educated as other people.
Yeah.
You don't really want to cruise around in rural Afghanistan or rural Iraq wearing a cross.
No.
That might be taken the wrong way. That may not mean to some people, oh, this is a first aid bag, right?
Yeah.
That may not, that symbol may not neatly cross across state lines, if you will.
Yeah.
So I know the Red Crescent was, I mean, again, from my reading on the subject, it's much more recent. It was born out of a much more recent movement in the global humanitarian movement. But I think Iran certainly has some influence there. They may be one of the most influential donors to the Red Crescent. But there's an organization that could be helping to comfort people, the alleviation of human suffering. And because I think in part it's associated with not just Iran, but there's this religious element about it, because that crescent itself is different than the cross. And again, I'm talking about just symbols and what symbols might mean. Because I see a red cross and the first thing I think is, oh, that's a first aid kit,
right?
Or that's the medic coming to help me.
Yeah, that's help, right?
Yeah, but that's not the same, right? I got a different set of lenses,
right?
But if I'm an uneducated rural Iraqi or Afghan and I see a red crescent, that might mean something different to me. Is that too far off base?
No, I don't think it's why there's a red crescent. Because look, it's Christians have a history of proselytizing, first of all, and then people use that to their advantage to make them counter the Christian message. So you already have that background going on. Also, these are not permissive environments. So to go walk around, you can protect yourself with the Red Cross, or you can protect yourself with the Red Crescent and native Arabic language. There's a reason why the Red Cross didn't send a bunch of, white folk who didn't speak Arabic out. There's a reason why they spent, the right people, the right area. And I'm not saying that they're good or bad at what they do, but to survive, to literally live in these areas, you've got to reduce your risk. And having a cross on your car is not as safe as having a crescent.
No. And in fact, if I had a choice of which vehicle I wanted to be in, it wouldn't be the one with the cross.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's what happens, though. We would set up these water filtration plants because we're good Americans and we want to help. And of course we do. But the problem is that because we just kind of jammed them down their throats, and these weren't Iraqi-inspired, Iraqi-provisioned, they sat. And they calcified and they stopped working. And so the Red Crescent realized that for a small amount of money, we can break this old filter out, replumb it, and then go to the imam in the area, and in some occasions, not all occasions, and say, hey, let's get a young man to come in here and swap this thing out every 3 weeks. We'll get you a bunch of filters, get you guys on your feet, and then you guys can sort it out. It's not a lot different than what the Americans did, except for they had a Red Crescent on their truck. They came in to fix something the Americans had failed at, and they tried to, when possible, to use the religious leader in the area to take the government out of it, because they weren't. Because the Red Cross does the same thing. They will come in and help, but they're not trying to prop up a local governor.
No, and they also don't. I would say that probably a lot of good-meaning people in the Red Cross who are operating on the ground in these environments may not have an understanding of the local culture and custom to the extent that members of the Red Crescent do, right? Because in some places, you're going to need that imam to come in and say, no, this is okay, So I think, and actually, if there are any listeners out there that, have any more information about this, it'd be nice to get some more observations so we can write to. Use these observations as evidence, because I see a missed opportunity. For example, perhaps the United States military, even the U.S. State Department, maybe could have been cooperating a bit more with an organization like the Red Crescent, which would essentially be not just are we now delivering services that are going to make people's lives better, but we're also doing is demonstrating to the Iraqis on the ground who have to live here that, well, look, the Americans are paying attention to us. The Americans are here. There is a true coalition of people trying to help us have better lives.
Yeah. So I want to change gears and get back to Afghanistan in a little bit of time we have left, because this is where these lessons that we learned by missing them in Iraq not understanding religion, not understanding the instability that we delivered all the time. Me watching us totally miss Sunni and Shia. I got to the point where I could see Sunni and Shia when they walked in the room, and then I could now interpret not just across language, but across that religious divide, right? And it made me a better advisor because I was seeing more of the conversation and hearing it. So now we go to Afghanistan, and in a lot of ways it's simpler, but I had a real plan. When we got there, the new part was the government was religion. And our favorite guy, Governor Zarif, gave us a lot of access and showed us how he used religion to solve problems as the state.
Well, you know what I like about the work that you did and then handed off to me with Zarif is because in addition to speaking about how we can actually engage religion for the purposes of providing security, this story speaks to how time-consuming, how resource intensive, and how much thought actually goes into planning this type of mission. And this is something we outline in very specific detail in our forthcoming paper, which we've talked about. We've had some other shows about. But this story really talks about how hard this stuff is. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult, right? So tell me a little bit about Zarif's ability to use religion to bring about or to help stabilize, a place that was, frequently not stable.
Yeah. Well, and this is just briefly, and just to provide context that you and I both have that it's not obvious. So we learned a lot about stability and what it mattered to families and to the governor and what they were able to do and not able to do. And there were a bunch of kinds of stability and security that had to be in place for the area to go forward. It wasn't really about the Taliban. It was about their own government couldn't protect them. So the Taliban remained the influencing force. They're also from that area. So if a dad can't leave his house safely, guess what he's not going to do? He's not going to leave his house. If he can't transmit his goods safely from the market and back with some money, all of these things take away from stability and are all, it makes education subordinate to these things. So Zarif recognized this.
Everything that the state is supposed to be doing, providing services such as education, making sure that there's a marketplace, all of these things cannot happen if there's no security.
Right. Yeah. Right. So he's trying to build security and stability and reduce the conflict in the area. Now, there is a lot of conflict. I mean, this is a place that's been at war for 40 years. We talk about long wars. There's a multi-generational war area in Afghanistan. And not that Afghanistan was like the Garden of the Mideast anyhow before that. So he did a couple of things. One is he used religion and used his power as a religious leader to draw in country folk. And these farmers, they are God-fearing people. And so he tried to reduce poppy growth by saying, look, as good Islamic farmers, you know better than to grow poppy. But I also know the government has to give you money because that's part of the deal. So let's make sure you guys don't grow poppy and get your money. I'm going to help you do that. He also used religion in cementing a decades-old land dispute that had everything. It was like the Hatfield McCoys. There was murder involved and everything else, and it was not resolved by the Taliban. They couldn't bring the proper elders together to get this thing resolved, but Zarif did. And when he got it solved, throughout that process, there was religious elements besides himself there to provide that religious requirement to bring agreement. So he always thought about religion's role in his stability. He wanted to improve the mosque so that, look, as a guy that uses religion to increase his ability to govern, and his mosque was a pad of clay.
Yeah. Yeah, he wasn't proud of his mosque.
No.
Well, the way it looked, but it was a mosque.
Yeah, and so that was where he wanted resources. Like, I need to rebuild this mosque. It needs to be a proper mosque because I'm going to use this power that I have. Yes, I'm a military leader. Yes, I'm a governor, but I'm also, and most importantly out here, a religious elder. And we saw this time and time again with him when we would give him the radio and say, "This is your radio," which is very non-doctrinal. I want you to use it. He would talk about prayer, and he would talk about Islam over the radio to his farmers, so they would hear that message all the time.
Well, and he also, I mean, because he was of the people, he understood informal governance. And he understood what his role was, and he understood how to bring together disparate interests. And it was that mantle of religious authority that not just helped add legitimacy to what he was doing in terms of the eyes of the people, but the other key leaders, the other stakeholders, the other people that were the warlords and that were the bad family leaders, the bad quote unquote tribal elders. They would defer to that religious leadership, but the fact that he was able to bring other religious leaders in and using the mechanisms of local custom and local culture, which was something that he understood, you know. Now, I think one thing that now will take us back full circle to where we started off with when you asked about the contribution of some of this work. What we do in this paper is we discuss how we were able with Zarif to merge that informal governing that he was doing with formal government, right? Because it's not that he didn't recognize his formal government, but what we did was we helped him understand essentially how to use his bureaucracy a little bit better.
Right.
And it didn't stop him from governing in an informal manner, but we did help him merge that informal power into the formal processes of government. And this is time-consuming work. I mean, I was there for 7 months. How much time did you spend before that working just with Zarif?
You know, probably 3 months before you got there.
Yeah, so we're looking at, 10 months to a year easy that we spent working and just understanding and actually doing a lot of staying out of the way. And Pete did a lot of work just watching him govern and watching his style. And when we talk about ground truth, that's what we're talking about, the ability to do that, right? And the ability to take off your lenses, remove your assumptions, and understand something as a blank slate. That doesn't mean you don't bring in or develop some of your own knowledge of history and local culture. That's part of it, but you have to understand that just because this guy's Mujahideen doesn't mean he hates us. And in fact, he might know a little bit more about the operating environment than we do.
Yeah. And he might know about where the Taliban is a terrible religious partner. Because we don't know.
Yeah. And he can actually get on the radio and speak to that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, listen, I mean, this is a good laydown of what the paper is going to be and where it's at, and I'm excited to present it with you this weekend in Alabama. And hey to everybody out there who's at the conference who's listening to this. We really appreciate you guys sticking with us, and definitely feel free to reach out to me. I'm easy. I'm all over social media, Pete A. Turner. I'm glad to talk to you. And then, Rich, of course, you're at Troy University. Why don't you let everybody know how they can get a hold of you?
Ledet at troy.edu. It's easy to find me, actually. You go to your handy-dandy Google and type in my name. There's a few guys like me out there, but there's only one Rich Ledet that's a political scientist, to my knowledge.
So far. All right, man.
Yeah, so far.
Thank you for coming on the show.
No problem, man. Man, I wish we'd had another 20 minutes to talk about our caveats and our warnings. But I guess we'll have to do that for another show.
Yes, we will.
But stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. And if you want the paper, just reach out to us, man. We've got more where this came from and more in the works.